As you're drawing in perspective, there's going to be a balance between drawing precisely and drawing loosely. And generally I err on the side of drawing loosely because it makes my sketches more interesting. But it is nice to be able to do some precise things in perspective. For instance, can you guess how to divide vertically both these sides? You might be able to get this first one right here. That looks like about the center. But it might be a little harder to guess where exactly this divides. Especially if you're new to perspective, it's really hard to eyeball. Well, there's a trick. So if you were to just draw an X across each of these faces, where they intersect is the middle. And no matter how foreshortened it is, this will always work. So if you wanted to divide this vertically, you would just pull in a vertical following the grid. And then theoretically, once you've divided it in this way, you could divide that again and divide that further still, but at some point you hit sort of diminishing returns. In my opinion, if you needed to do something that was this exact, probably it would be better done in a 3D program. Something like SketchUp would just make your job a lot easier. So I'm not going to look too deeply into extremely precise methods inside of Photoshop. If you want to know that kind of stuff about perspective, there's plenty of resources out there, so you should look for those. But I'm going to focus more on what's practical for just sort of freehand perspective. Now, that said, there is some measuring that's incredibly important. So, for instance, if you had a person in your illustration, you want all the people in your illustration to be the right size. If one person was way too big, it just wouldn't look right. So let's figure out how to measure to put another person or two into this scene. So what I'm going to do is take where he's standing, and I'm going to project that back towards the building, and then I'm going to pull a vertical, and I'll do the same with his head. I'll project his head back towards the building. Although I got to get my perspective correct. All right, that looks good. Now where they intersect, that is a person height. So I could call that dimension there sort of like 6 feet tall, if the original dimension was 6 feet tall. So once you've got that dimension in there, just project it around your scene. So for instance, 6 feet here is 6 feet right here. If I wanted to go back into the distance, that would all be 6 feet high. So really any of these lines, if I were to pull a vertical down here, got to get my perspective right. If I were to pull a vertical, that would be a 6 foot thing. So if I wanted to have a person standing a little ways away from the wall, I'd project out that way. Do the same with the top of the 6 feet. And that right there would be a person. So let's copy this guy over and see if it looks right. That looks about right. Now another thing this is incredibly useful for are things like doors. You would want a door to be the right height relative to a person. So I'll bring my line back here, and I could safely assume that a door is maybe a foot taller than a person. So that will be the top of my door line. So to make a door, I would use that as the top, pull down some verticals, and there I have a nice door. But let's say I wanted another door. Okay, so I'll project the top of it around the building. So this is the door height line, and then I'll project that over there. And now anywhere along there I could put another door. So here I could safely assume that this door is the same height as the other door because their tops line up along this line. And then of course when you're done with the actual doors, you would erase your measuring lines because you don't need those anymore. But even though those steps felt a little bit cumbersome, once you've got a few landmarks in your image like this, it gets a lot easier to make the rest just sort of work. So sometimes I like to start a drawing by putting in doors and a couple people, and then as I'm drawing, everything else just has a better shot at fitting into the right scale. But it is incredibly important when you have a drawing that's really foreshortened like this. So putting in a second door on this second building might be a challenge. Except you remember that the tops will line up. So even though the buildings are different height, you know that If the top of the door is along that line, it will be in the correct height. And likewise, if I wanted to put in some more people, I would need the people height. Now he is not standing next to the door, as you can see as I zoom in. He's standing a little bit in front of the door. So I'd project his height towards the door. So you can see he's a little bit shorter. And then I would take that line and project that out into space. So if I wanted to have someone standing a little further away from the wall, I would need to project out in the other direction. See, if I go that way, maybe even a little further, this is still 6 feet tall. So if I drop a vertical down, wherever that hits the ground, which happens to be right there, that is 6 feet. So I could take a person and make them that scale and they would be correct. So here's an example of a time where measuring would be really nice. I've got this one tree, but let's say I wanted some evenly spaced trees down a road. Okay, so I'm going to hide the tree for a second, and I'm just going to draw sort of the plane that my trees are going to land on. So that's where it starts, and then maybe far away in the background goes about that far. Now I'm not sure how tall it's going to be. I have to project this line here back into perspective to see where that ends up. Okay, so that's actually quite a bit too tall. So I'll do the same thing with the bottom. And this here is the plane that all the trees are going to exist on. Now I need to figure out how they're going to be spaced. So I'll start by dividing it in half. Find my midline. Then I'll divide each of those halves further in half. And once I've measured this out here, each of those verticals is just going to be where I put one of my trees. So here I'll put a little base on there. I'm going to show my tree again. Now I'm just going to duplicate. Although you would probably draw these individually, but just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to save a little time by duplicating. And then I'm going to distort to make sure that they are pointing the correct vertical direction, so they're in 3-point perspective. Now it's important to make sure that the bottom and the top touch those vertical lines. And then because I did some duplicating here, mine have a little overlap, so I'm just going to erase away what I don't need. And then I hide my guide, and what I'm left with is a nicely arranged line of trees. And I really like this about freehand perspective, because we got two good things going here. One, the drawing feels loose. It still feels energetic because my trees are very organic. They're sketches. But at the same time, the drawing's very structured. It really shows depth correctly because I took the time to do the correct perspective measuring. So if you can find a good balance like this, you're going to be really successful with your freehand perspective.